Welcome to the Expert Talks by Kalkine TV. I'm Sage. Today's guest is Mr Jihad Dib, New South Wales Labor Minister for Emergency Services. A significant part of the east coast of Australia has been impacted by an unusual rain bomb weather system which has brought numerous wet days to the region. Flooding has been experienced in Brisbane City and other parts of southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales, namely the towns of Lismore and Ballina, where hundreds of thousands have been given evacuation orders. Resources are under duress, with the SES tallying over 8,800 calls for help overnight on Tuesday and undertook 300 flood rescues in the northern area of New South Wales. It was reported by the Camden Times. And as the Warragamba Dam in Sydney is now beginning to flood low-lying areas in Sydney too, we have the New South Wales Labor Minister for Emergency Services joining us today. Thank you for being available, Jihad.
Pleasure, Sage. We got there in the end. How are you going?
Well, thank you. And we need to share your insights on this emergency situation. As the Shadow Minister for Emergency Services, what are your main concerns for the current flood emergency in northern New South Wales?
Well, look, in the first instance, the primary concern is making sure that people are safe and evacuations have taken place. And I think that's the human element of it. And my heart goes out to, and I'm sure I share this with all the people in New South Wales, to those who have tragically lost their loved ones. We know that there was 4 fatalities and we hope that it doesn't climb anymore, but we've got to brace ourselves for the fact that it might. But the evacuation and getting people to safety and then looking after them and making sure that they've got somewhere where they can stay overnight and be safe and comfortable has got to be the priority. We've also seen the shift and the change. So in Lismore, that northern New South Wales area now, where the rain has eased a bit and the flooding's starting to subside, we've actually now seen that move towards the Hunter, the Upper Hunter area, the North Coast, the South Coast, and of course Greater Sydney. So this is ever changing, it's ever evolving, but our priority in the very first instance has to be about making sure that people are safe, that we evacuate people, that people are well looked after.
It's terrible to hear that people are dying over this weather system, and as the storm moves towards Sydney, hopefully it'll be less intense. Some people weren't aware of the extent of flooding in Lismore back in 2017. Do you think this current crisis could be avoided by not allowing people to live in the low-lying areas of Lismore and Ballina?
Well, I think, Sage, what we saw with the floods, especially in Lismore, was how quickly the water rose, and I think that caught a lot of people by surprise. People who had been there for the 2017 floods, or people had seen floods in the past, because let's keep in mind that Lismore does flood, quite regularly, where there's high rising river levels. But I think the sheer volume of what came through and how quickly it rose caught a lot of people by surprise. Now, in terms of the planning and things like that, in terms of where people live and how we can better improve houses and better improve levees and better improve protections for communities, those things will have to be discussed, and those things really need to formulate our plan in moving forward. I don't think that right now people want to know what's going on, but as I said, in the first instance, it's about making sure people are safe, doing the cleanup. Hopefully the recovery isn't as devastating as what we predict it might be, and then beginning with the rebuild. But we don't want to be in this situation again and say, we didn't learn anything from the 2022 floods. I think that's a really key point. And I would dare say that once this is over, and hopefully it will be over soon, then when a whole heap of people will get together and say, well, what went right? What went wrong? What did we do that we could have done better, that maybe could have at least, if not prevented this, could have mitigated it a lot more?
I can imagine that they would have probably just recovered from the 2017 flooding in Lismore, and now this will not be good for the morale out there. Do you think better management of drainage systems and even using suctioning of waterways could help with this to alleviate the crisis?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of things that look after. Certainly the idea of drainage systems and suctioning systems will definitely become part of the mix of what we could do to be better. I gave a little bit of an example earlier where there's parts of Greater Sydney, where I live, where the rivers, because of the tide and because there's plenty of water in there at the moment, there's kind of like the water's coming back up through the drains. But certainly, I think in idea of preparations, you would like to assume that councils are constantly keeping the drains clear, keeping the drains clean, so that water that does run can run through as quickly as possible. What we don't want is the blockages occurring and the debris, because what we have seen in Lismore and in other parts of the state is just how quickly that water rises. I really, and I say this and I press on this point, and it's not a political point at all, because I think there's a role for government, for opposition, for the crossbenchers. We need to look at this and actually say, what is it that we can identify that we need to do better, that we must do better, that we need to put resources in to protect those communities? Because if it's a drainage issue, let's fix the drains. If it's a levee issue around the rivers, then let's fix that. If it's a building issue, then we've got to make sure the houses are better prepared. And also if it's a response issue. So there's a whole range of things that will need to be formulated and discussed at the end of this and acted upon. But in the first instance, the absolute priority has to be about people's safety.
You're absolutely right, and the extent, the impacts of this extent are not just extend further than just these emergency services, sorry, is what I'm trying to say. You have insurance companies, you have schools that are all affected by these flooding type emergencies. And we're hearing of people stuck on their rooftops for hours. Now this must be very unnerving and dangerous. How do you think that situation could be dealt with better?
Well, Jane, I think, you put yourself in that position where you're stuck on your rooftop for hours, and then add to that the fact that you're fearful of what could be happening. You don't necessarily know what's been happening. You may be not getting all the communication that you need. You're getting anxious. You're seeing the waters rise. You're seeing things floating down the street. And then add another layer of that of when it gets dark and you actually don't know what's going on. You don't see what's going on. So that itself is a horrific situation. And I can imagine it's incredibly frightening, and probably potentially causes people to take some risks. One of my colleagues, Janelle Saffin from Lismore, actually had to swim to safety from her house because the water had risen so quickly. Her husband needed to be rescued. Her and her staff member actually rescued people with a kayak. And I think, that's for people who are getting quite anxious. Now, I know that the emergency services, the volunteers and the ADF tried to do the best they can. But I would also suggest that maybe even just letting people know, whether it's loudspeakers or things like that. And again, I wasn't on the ground, so I don't know what specifically they could have done. But giving people reassurance that they're there, that you'll be there with them, that you're supporting them. Because if it's dark and the water is rising and you don't know what's going on, I can imagine the heightened sense of anxiety and the fear.
Exactly. I'm hearing other stories similar to what you've just said of people taking matters in their own hands. What are your recommendations for people taking matters in their own hands?
Well, isn't it a great thing about the Aussie spirit, regardless of where you come from or how long you've been in Australia? We've got this great Aussie spirit where it's about helping people out. And it's about that sense of community. And I think that's very noble and it's a really wonderful thing. But I would also urge people to make sure that they don't put themselves at risk by trying to help others. So in other words, if you're not a strong swimmer, I don't know that you're going to be really helpful if you're going to try in and swim into some waters that you're not a very strong swimmer about. If you're good, strong with your kayak or your paddle, you've got those resources and you can use them and it's safe, then work to complement the state emergency services. Don't go in, on your own accord. But I think those stories about the, I suppose, inextinguishable human spirit are the things that really drive us, and those things that we hear and the things that show us the kind of mettle that we have as a community. And that's really the wonderful thing. You can also be of assistance in other ways. So I don't wear an SES uniform. I'm not actually a member of the SES, but I was able to organise yesterday locally for some people, and I assisted them in packing sandbags, for example. What can we do that may be able to free the state emergency services to do a job? Follow all the instructions would have been a good thing. Take all the advice as serious at the very beginning. Let's hope we don't need rescues because people didn't do the wrong, didn't follow the instructions as quickly as they needed to. But it's heroic and it's wonderful, but it's also one that we need to work to complement the emergency services and people who are capable. But I would also say, please be careful that you don't put yourself at risk, because that also then may put additional pressure on the emergency services.
Exactly. And yes, you're so right. I mean, supply chains have been disrupted. People can obviously help by also donating non-perishable goods related to food stuff to those affected areas. And it'll be days now till the water subsides. How are the evacuation centres being managed, in your opinion?
Well, I think we've got to get people into evacuation centres, and we're seeing more and more centres open up all of the time. And some of them with their schools, with their community centres, with their RSL clubs, anywhere that's at higher ground. I think in the first instance, getting people into evacuation centres is very good. But we've got to make sure that the evacuation centre also is an experience where you feel safe, you're fed, you're clothed, you've got an opportunity to, reflect a little bit, and all of the resources that's required. Now, that means all the government agencies are there, so that if you need some support with emergency payments, you don't have to go anywhere. It will come to you. If you need to speak to insurance companies, then it will come to you. If you need to locate some missing relatives or friends, then all the services are there. So I think, look, as I said, at this point, my job is not necessarily to go out and say everything that's going wrong. I really want to talk about the things that exist and how we can best utilise them and what we need to make sure we do. I think there's merit in looking at what do we do in terms of in the future, ensuring that the evacuation centres that we've got ready to be open are fully stocked and ready to go, because I think that's where a little bit that angst comes in. And of course, you've got people now who are desperate to try and get home, if for nothing else, just to try and clean up. But they can't go home yet until waters have subsided, until the emergency services have actually gone through the homes, because the tragedy is bodies have been found inside homes. So, I think a little bit of that patience. But I suppose, how do you, in such an unnormal situation, normalise it as much as possible, I think is the key. Keep people's spirits up. There's devastation everywhere. Apart from those who have lost their loved ones, people have lost businesses, farms that have gone under, people have lost their pets. I think we need to give people an opportunity to effectively be grieving in the way that they do, and make it as comfortable as we can for them, and make sure that those evacuation centres, are as comfortable as possible, where there's privacy and where there's all the support that families need.
Yes, it's not an easy situation at all even to be talking about. And thank you for being available to speak to us today. Do you have any recommended avenues that people can use to reach out and donate or offer their volunteer services?
Yeah, no, thanks. Well, thanks for having me, Sage. And I think the first thing I would say, that because if you can donate, that's terrific. But even before I get to that, I just would really like to urge people again, please follow all the instructions of state emergency services. In an emergency, ring them. If it's life-threatening, you've got to ring 000. But the other thing too is, don't take unnecessary risks. You may not be in a flooded area, but the roads are very wet, so please drive safely. Don't drive through flooded waters. Don't drive on a road and say, look, there's a little bit of water, it's okay. The more that we can do to be sensible if we're not in a flood-affected area, the more it frees up the SES. In terms of donations, I know that there's a relationship developing a group called Give It, and you can do that through the government website. So basically, it's something that was run through from Queensland. They're running that really well, where people can donate things. Because one thing we learned from the bushfire tragedy from a couple of years ago, the disaster there, is that a lot of people wanted to donate and give lots of things, which was excellent. But it wasn't necessarily always going to the place where it needed to go, or you got too much of one thing in one place or the other. The Red Cross, I know, is also accepting donations. If you don't want to do a donation, maybe if you can drop off like a packet of biscuits or something to the local SES, offer them anything that you can, because these are people who are volunteering, who train 1 day a week, who are always there for us. There's going to be plenty of time to help. I would imagine community groups now will be starting to mobilise in terms of going to help with cleanups, cooking, and what they need. But the Give It is a good platform, because it basically then links people up with the things that they require. So we don't end up with, 5,000 of one item and only 3 of another. I think that's a really good one. And thank you to everybody who does volunteer, who does make a donation, who keeps their awareness, who's being sensible, who shares the information. Check out the SES website and the Bureau of Meteorology website all the time, because it's constantly updating. And what we've learned, if nothing else from this, is how quickly the situation evolves. From when I spoke to you an hour ago to now, it's changed again. So please be wary and please be safe.
Thank you so much for your valuable insights, and I can imagine you're very busy, so appreciate the time you've given us today.
My pleasure, Sage. Thanks a lot. You have a good one, and everyone take care, and let's get through this together.
Thank you. Now, if you've just joined us, we had a very informative discussion with New South Wales Labor Minister for Emergency Services, Mr Jihad Dib. To watch the full interview, please go to Kalkine Media's YouTube channel and keep watching Kalkine for more live expert talks and market updates. Till the next episode, stay apprised and invest wise with Kalkine.